Howdy folks, and welcome to this episode of Music Theory Deep Dive, where we take a long swim through the sea of music theory. Today we'll be finishing up our introduction to key changes with modulation. So what is modulation anyway? This term often gets used and misused in many different ways, so a lot of people are very fuzzy about its definition. If we think back to our previous Part 1 video, we discussed tonicization, which is where we use chord progressions to emphasize a chord in the key that isn't the tonic as if it were the tonic. For example, if we stuck a secondary dominant chord in front of the 2 chord of a key, like so. Although we ended up very temporarily using some of the notes that are outside of the key, our ultimate goal with tonicization is to lead into a chord that is naturally existing in the original key, or in other words, is diatonic to the key. By contrast, modulation is where we have a chord progression that takes us outside from the key where we start in and keeps us outside. We're heading towards a chord that is not diatonic to the first key. Or, put more simply, tonicization emphasizes chords that are within the key, whereas modulation leads us to chords that are outside of the key. Modulation is the path we take from one key to another. But this path can be as long or as short as we want. In fact, it can be so short that there really isn't a path. It just sort of happens. You can actually have key changes that are just totally abrupt with no subtlety or setup at all. In fact, these are some of the most common key changes in pop music. Pop music here meaning all popular music like pop, rock, hip-hop, etc., as opposed to nerdy, esoteric music like classical, jazz, progressive metal, stuff that it probably helps to have a music degree in order to understand. The most common key change in pop music is the sudden key change up a half step for the final chorus of a song. There are thousands of songs that do this, as it's a really easy way to inject some fresh excitement into a song that might otherwise feel like it's losing some steam in the home stretch. This abrupt half-step key change is sometimes jokingly referred to as the trucker's key change, as if you just shift gears and bam, new key. Let's look at some examples. As mentioned, the most common abrupt key change is up a half-step. The song For Once in My Life, recorded by many artists, but most famously by Stevie Wonder, whose example we'll look at here, spends most of the song in the key of F major, before the final, we'll call it section since it's not really a verse-chorus song form exactly. There's a short 2-measure interlude that's played once in the key of F major and then immediately repeated up a half step in F sharp major. It's basically just a 1 to 5 progression with a couple of hip chromatic chords stuck in the middle. After this abrupt change, the rest of the song repeats the earlier material, but in the new key of F sharp major and stays there until the end. Another great abrupt half-step up example, perhaps the greatest example, is Love on Top by Beyonce. You'll see this song on just about every single list of top 10 key changes in music because, well, you'll see here in a moment, it's pretty cool. Most of this song is in the key of C major until the final chorus. We get the entire chorus in the key of C major, which is a pretty straightforward progression. It's basically a 1-4-5 progression, just with some hip passing chords. Specifically a tritone sub for the 5 of 4 and a borrowed 6th chord from the parallel minor, but don't worry if that all sounds like gibberish because it's not necessary to understand for our discussion right now. Just know that it makes it sound really hip. So anyway, the phrase ends on the 5 chord. Well, a fancy suspended version of it, but a 5 chord nonetheless. We expect it to resolve back home to C major like it does every other phrase, but instead, we're smacked in the face with the key of D flat major. Out of nowhere, we're up a half step. Now if that were the end of it, this song would just be another common use of the half-step up key change. But wait, there's more. 8 bars later, we get another key change up another half-step to the key of D major. Then another 8 bars later, yet another key change to E flat major, and 8 bars after that, you guessed it, a 4th key change in a row, taking us now to E major. This is impressive from a performance standpoint because moving that many keys up from the starting point can be pretty taxing on the vocal range of the singer, but clearly Beyonce is up to the task here. The second impressive thing is that this creates a bit of a musical pun, and who doesn't love puns? The song is entitled Love on Top. On top. As in the keys keep shifting higher and higher? Anyway, songs don't exclusively have to use the half-step key changes. Here's some other examples. I Want to Dance with Somebody by Whitney Houston changes keys up a whole step for the final chorus from the original key of G flat major to the key of A flat major. Happy Together by the Turtles does a parallel key change from the key of F sharp minor to the key of F sharp major between the verses and the choruses. Some songs have really odd disjunct key changes. Makes You Happy by Liz Phair moves from the key of D flat major in the verses to the key of F major in the choruses. Although these two keys are very unrelated, the shift is actually quite smooth since the verse ends on a G flat major chord, which is the 4 chord of the key, and the chorus begins on F major, the tonic of the new key. These two chords are only a half step apart, which helps bridge the overall more distant gap between the keys. This is a general pattern in modulations. The point where the key change happens almost always has chords that are very musically close together, especially if the keys are very different from each other. You'll almost always see one of three things: chords stepping up or down by one note, especially by half step, and especially if both chords are the same kind of chords, such as two major chords side by side. Chords that share the same root but different qualities, like the Turtle song that goes from F sharp minor to F sharp major. Chords that move by fifth. Even though a fifth is a larger distance in pitch, notes that are a fifth apart still have a very close relationship. They're right next to each other on the circle of fifths, they will always be found together in at least two keys, and, to get a little nerdy and technical for a second, the frequency ratio between the roots is 3 to 2. It's mathematically as simple as you can get without the notes just being the same, either as an octave or a unison. In other words, fifths are important. They're very, very closely linked together, so don't underestimate their importance. One last example of a sudden modulation is Buddy Holly by Weezer. It changes keys between the verses and the choruses, but does so in a much gentler, more subtler way than all of the previous examples. The verses are in the key of F minor, and the choruses are in the key of A flat major. There's a significant mood shift between the two, but since as a pair they're the relative minor and major keys to each other, meaning they share all the same notes but with different tonics, the key change is smooth and natural instead of sudden and unexpected. Okay, so far we've seen a lot of examples of very abrupt key changes without any real setup or transition between them. Modulation generally refers to how we get from one key to another through some kind of transitional chord progression. Let's take a look at some songs that actually have transitions. In classical music, modulations tend to happen to closely related keys, meaning keys that share mostly the same notes between them. The two most common are switches between the relative major and minor keys, and switching between two keys next to each other on the circle of fifths. This is in contrast to the more sudden, dramatic key changes in the pop examples we just looked at, where there's a much bigger difference in notes between keys. Side note, by classical I mean generally to include all music from the Baroque era, the classical era proper, Romantic and Impressionist music, and pretty much anything you would hear played by an orchestra, a string quartet, or any other classical ensemble. A good example to start with is the classic Minuet in G, that is not by J.S. Bach. He's almost always attributed as the composer, but it was actually composed by one of Bach's contemporaries, Christian Petzold. Bach just happened to gift his wife a copy of the music for her collection, and ever since people have mistakenly assumed Bach wrote it. The minuet is a great example of a binary form piece, which is generally a short work in two equally sized halves, hence the label of binary. Each of the two halves usually repeat, which is the case here. This minuet begins in the key of G major and stays there throughout the first half. The second half is where the modulation occurs, and it's really sneaky. Most modulations in classical music, also called common practice music, modulate by the use of what are often called pivot chords or common chords. I'll stick with the term pivot chords for this video. This is where a chord or chords that are shared between the two keys are used to bridge the gap between the keys. The keys of G major and D major are about as close to each other as you can get. They're right next to each other on the circle of fifths, which means that they share 6 of the same 7 notes. The only note that's different is C. The key of G major has a C natural, while the key of D major has a C sharp. If we look at the most important chords for each key, the 1 chord and the 5 chord, we get the following. For G major, 1 is G and 5 is D. For D major, 1 is D and 5 is A. As you can see, both keys share a D major chord. To create a pivot chord modulation, simply have a chord progression that uses the shared chord in the middle. In the second half of the minuet, we see this idea used twice. Measure 17 begins on the 1 chord in G major, followed by the 5 chord D in the next measure. The third measure has an E minor chord, which is the 6 chord in G major, and an entirely normal thing to expect to hear in this key. However, both the D major chord and the E minor chord also overlap with the key of D major, being the 1 and the 2 chords respectively. When we hit the 4th measure, we see a very conspicuous C sharp arrive, letting our ears know that we're not in the key of G major anymore. However, because the previous 2 chords, D major and E minor, are present in both keys, the modulation between the 2 keys is smooth and seamless. You can't quite tell where one ends and the next begins. Rather than being a black and white contrast of 2 keys, it's more of a shades of gray blending between the two. For the return home to the key of G major, we see the same idea. The second 4-bar phrase has a very strong, perfect, authentic cadence in the key of D major in measure 24. But once we arrive on that chord, the bass line descends to a C natural, indicating that we're on the move again, away from the key of D and back to the key of G. This resolves to a G major chord in the next measure to begin the next phrase, and completing a 5-to-1 progression in the home key of G major. The elision, or overlap here, is much shorter than the earlier modulation, lasting for only 2 beats in measure 24 and only using just one chord, the D major chord. Let's look at another example of modulation that is still smooth between keys, but with less overlap and a more obvious break between keys. Let's take the jazz tune Solar, that's not by Miles Davis. So a little bit of history. Guitarist Chuck Wayne wrote and recorded a song called Sonny in 1946, named after trumpeter Sonny Berman, who played on the recording session. The album was never released, and Chuck never copyrighted the tune. Miles changed the first chord from C major to C minor, but otherwise kept the entire melody intact, retitled the song as Solar, and released it about a decade later. Miles was a brilliant musician, but not always on the up and up when it came to credit and authorship. Amusingly, the first 2 measures of Solar are etched onto Miles's gravestone. Anyway, Solar begins in the key of C minor, and in the 3rd and 4th measures we have the chords G minor 7 and C7, which are a 2-5 progression in the key of F, which is where the progression resolves to at the beginning of the next phrase. Here we have a pivot chord modulation like in the minuet. The G minor 7 chord is both the minor 5 chord in the opening key of C minor, as well as the 2 chord in the key of F, the key it's headed to next. The 2 keys are just 2 clicks apart in the circle of fifths, meaning they're only different by 2 notes. After this, however, is the really interesting part. The F major 7 chord in measures 5 to 6 is then followed by an F minor 7 chord. That's clearly a key change, since F major and F minor don't coexist together in any one key. However, they are both F chords. 2 of the notes, the root and the 5th, F and C, stay the same, while the 3rd and 7th of F major 7, A and E, move down by half step to the 3rd and 7th of F minor 7, A flat and E flat. This combination of common tones and smooth half-step motion, plus the fact that the root notes of both chords stay the same, creates a very smooth transition between keys. When the roots of the 2 chords are the same, as is the case here, but the qualities change from major to minor or vice versa, this is called a mode change or a change of mode. The dividing line is much more clear here than in the pivot chord modulation earlier in the song, and both modulations we discussed in the minuet, but this mode change modulation still sounds very smooth and connected. This new F minor 7 chord is now the 2 chord of a new 2-5-1 progression, this time in the key of E flat major, another 2 clicks away on the circle of fifths. After that, the same shift happens yet again in measure 10, with E flat major 7 giving way to E flat minor 7, and yet another 2-5-1 happens, just at a faster rhythmic rate, this time in the key of D flat major, again, 2 clicks over on the circle of fifths. The final modulation happens in the last measure at the D minor 7 flat 5 chord. Although it looks a little different since the roots are changing between the D flat major 7 and D minor 7 flat 5 chords, the roots are actually the only thing changing. The other 3 notes in both chords are actually identical, creating a very smooth modulation between the key of D flat major and the home key of C minor. Within just 12 bars, Solar hits on 3 different modulations that are very common in jazz. The pivot chord in measure 3, the major to minor mode changes in measures 7 and 10, and the final common tone shift in measure 12, where everything stays the same except the bass notes of D flat going to D natural. Alright, it's time for a little practice. Here's some examples of modulations between keys. The first example is a bit of a no-brainer. This is the kind we see in pop tunes very commonly. Pause the video and see if you can name the starting and ending keys, and if you can identify where the modulation occurs. As always, be sure to play through these examples. A lot of the time, our ears are much faster at spotting modulations than our eyes are. Trust your ears. Ready? Okay, the answer is pretty easy this time. The progression starts in the key of G major with a 1-4-5-1, followed by exactly the same thing, but up a half step in the key of A flat major. The second example is also one of the easier ones to spot, a mode change modulation. Okay, got your answers ready? Here's the solution. The example begins in the key of F minor with a 1-4-6-5 progression. The 5th measure, at the F major chord, is where there is a mode change from the previous key of F minor to the new key of F major. Same tonic, F, but a different collection of notes surrounding F. The progression finishes up with 4 and back to 1 in F major. Example 3 is of a common tone modulation where 2 chords share a lot of the same notes but have different roots. This one will be slightly more difficult to see, but it's fairly easy to hear. Got your answers ready? Alright. The first 3 chords are a simple 1-4-5 progression in A flat major. The first inversion C7 chord is where the modulation occurs. Although at first glance, E flat major and C7 don't appear to have much of a relationship, they both share the notes G and B flat. The E flat moves up by a half step to E natural, placed here in the bass to emphasize the connection by having them both in the bottom voice of each chord. The C7 chord is now a 5 chord in the key of F major, and it resolves to the 1 chord to wrap up the progression. Lastly, let's look at an example of a pivot chord modulation. This will be the hardest to find because there isn't a clear-cut breakpoint, so instead, try to find which chords overlap, forming a bridge between the two keys. Ready? Okay, here's the answer. This one begins in the key of C major with 1, 4, 1, 5. The D major chord in the 5th measure is our clue that a shift has occurred because it's not found in the key of C. Instead, we're now in the key of G and finish up the progression with a 1, 4, 5, 1 in this key. The overlap happens with the 3rd and 4th chords, G and C. At first they sound like 5 and 1 in the key of C, and we have no reason to expect anything else. Only after the fact, our ears revise that opinion and retroactively hear them as possibly being a 1 and a 4 in the key of G. Okay, because pivot chord modulations are kind of tricky to spot, here's a second example. Alright, answers ready? This progression begins in C major, with the first 3 chords being 1, 2, and 5, followed by an E minor chord. The A7 chord is our first chord that's not in the key of C, and it resolves to a D major 7 chord, creating a 5 to 1 progression in the key of D major. That E minor chord beforehand is the overlap point, because it's both the 3 chord in C major and the 2 chord in D major. Fun fact, this is the exact modulation that occurs in the bridge of My Girl by the Temptations, leading into the final chorus. Modulations can get more complex than the examples we looked at today, but they're often based in the simpler ones we did look at. Key changes can be abrupt, as we first discussed, with no real transitions between keys, or on the other extreme, they can be so smooth and subtle that there's no clear point where one key ends and the next begins. Ultimately, though, key changes and the modulations that link them together are a powerful tool to spice up music and keep it full of surprises for our ears. Thanks for watching, and, as always, enjoy your journey in search of the harmonic truth. See you next time.